Hey everybody, it's Alistair, aka That Pesky Social Worker, coming at you with part 3 of the Anatomy of Grief. So, if you haven't been with me the last couple of days, I'm just going to do a quick little review. If you have been, thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. So, in this process, we've been talking about defining grief and defining mourning. And also, today we're going to be talking about the difference between grieving and mourning. And yesterday, we also discussed the types of grief. So, to review, grief is the feeling of sadness that comes from bereavement. So, what is bereavement? What does it mean to be bereaved? That means being in the state of losing someone or something. Now, I know I flagged something the last couple of days and haven't really talked about it. I'm going to be digging into that today. And so, when we talk about mourning, again, I turned to our friends over at Merriam-Webster just because I believe dictionary definitions are a good foundation. Are they always, what's the phrase I want to use? Are they the exact, word currency that we're looking for all the time? No, but I think it's good to get us all on the same page. So, mourning by Merriam Webster is defined as the act of sorrowing. Also, as the outward sign, in parentheses, such as black clothes or armband, which is very old school, for grief of a person's death, or what do we got here? I have a hard time reading my own handwriting. I'm looking at my planner. A period of time in which signs of grief are shown. Okay. So, grief is the emotion that we feel when we lose someone or something. Mourning is the process of working through that emotion, of working through that sorrow, of working through that loss. So, what does mourning and grieving look like? Are they the same? Are they different? Number one, they're radically different. Again, grief is the feeling, mourning is the process. A lot of people use those words interchangeably, but that's not really accurate because you can have grief without mourning. I see this a lot. I had a family member of a patient who had one parent who had died 8 months prior on hospice and then had to sign her second parent up for hospice not much longer after the first parent had died. That can also lead to another kind of grief that I didn't talk about yesterday, but we would call it cumulative grief, which is when you experience a series of losses and don't really have the time to recover. So you can have that grief. I've seen people be full of grief, and it manifests itself in crying, in being unconsolable in a lot of ways, irritability. It can also manifest in terms of procrastination, people putting off tasks, focusing solely on caregiving, and then experiencing caregiver burnout and not being able to emotionally show up for their loved one. And then that leads to anticipatory grief about the fact of, oh my God, I'm going to lose another person. I haven't processed the fact that I lost this other one. And they're not allowing themselves to work through it. It gets ramped up into anticipatory grief all over again. So, mourning again is that process of working through it. Now, in hospice, when we talk about grief and we talk about mourning, again, in the traditional context, this is about a person that we're losing. Outside of the hospice realm, grief and mourning applies in a lot of places. Loss is not limited just to human life. If you've ever lost a pet, that is a real loss. That is something that causes grief and something that you have to mourn, because for a lot of us, I know especially there are people who are unable to have children that have very, very, very close connections with their pets. And for them, those are their children. That's a family member that has the same caliber and weight as a human relationship. And so the grief and mourning process, and I speak as someone who is one of those people, the grief process for that animal is very much the same as it is for a person because of the relationship and the connection. Now, in a more tangible way, think about our life prior to the pandemic. Think about the ability to go out to various restaurants, the ability to drive to your job if you can't do that now. Think about the way life was in November, December, January, before February, March, April. Now we're into May. Think about what your life looked like. Now take a good look around. There's been a lot of loss. We have lost the ability to freely, there are some people who are still choosing to walk around without masks to go about willy-nilly and to just spread things because they think that, a pandemic doesn't apply to them. But if you're following safety precautions, a lot of us have lost the ability to either A, work, or B, go to work. A lot of us have lost the ability to have our children in daycare programs or at school. A lot of us have lost the ability to realistically have separation from the family unit. So we can have that away time, go do our work, and then come back and show up. A lot of us have lost the ability to gather with friends and create memories in the ways that we're used to doing it. A lot of us have lost so many forms of connection, of expression, of ways of being in this world. And we're seeing this manifest right now because mental health is in the national discourse. Prior to the pandemic, it was in the national discourse surrounding, mass shootings and how mental health, mental health, mental health. Trust me, there are plenty of perfectly quote unquote sane people who would pass a battery of clinical tests that would still not think twice about picking up a firearm and walking into a crowd of people. I assure you that there are plenty of people who don't have anything clinically wrong with them that still do these things. So I think that's a big falsehood that I'm just gonna smash right there. It's not all mentally ill people that are gonna cause harm. There are plenty of sane, non-clinically wrong, or however you want to phrase that. There's nothing on paper that we can document and say, there was a diagnosis. No, there are sane, healthy people who have warped ideas that believe that what they're doing is righteous and justified. Okay, so mental health doesn't have anything to do with that particular aspect. Is it a factor? Yes. Is it the only thing? No. It's going to stop right there. So, grief is what we're all collectively experiencing right now. But not a lot of us are mourning. Not a lot of us are taking the time to process that feeling of loss. And I saw this when I still worked in my home health agency, and I think anybody who's working in any kind of big business right now, if you're working for any kind of corporation, if you're not working for a small business, you're probably seeing this. The first couple of weeks of the pandemic, I noticed when I was working, everything was expected to stay the same. It didn't matter that I was now working from home exclusively after spending, as a home health and hospice social worker, I'm going to people's houses. I'm traveling. The most miles I ever put on my car in one day for travel was like 112, and I did not leave the county. Like, the county that I worked in was really large. So I spent 3 to 4 hours a day driving and only 3 to 4 hours on a computer. A lot of time was FaceTime. My days were not 8-hour days. My days were realistically 10 to 12 to sometimes 14. That's just what it did. So there were all these huge shifts. I lost my ability to see my patients. I lost my ability to have that face-to-face connection. I lost the ability to have face-to-face connections with my coworkers, with my supervisors. I lost connection. And the message from admin, not just to me, but the general message, because this is what people in positions of administration do, and I can dig into more in clinical versus admin later because those are two radically different worlds. It was maintain status quo. And then collectively, everybody in corporate America realized, shit, we can't ask people to just keep acting like nothing's wrong because everybody's stressing out. Because when you can't send your kids to school, I think about my home care nurses. Okay, you're going out and you're seeing people that you don't know whether they're positive or not. You're on a PPE shortage, so that means that, you might not even be wearing a respirator, you just might be wearing a surgical mask, and B, that mask that you get is the only one that you get all day. Doesn't matter how many patients you see, one mask per clinician per day. That's it. And then they have to come home to a house full of, anywhere from 1 to 5 kids in some cases, and a spouse who may or may not be emotionally with it and sensitive, or might be dealing with their own stress. And so now you have someone who's responsible for taking care of other people that may or may not be a carrier of, the virus that's causing this pandemic, bringing it home to their own families, women have been struggling with this for the longest time. We're just now recognizing it because it's like, oh, well, you have to work from home and be a mom, and I guess we can't get out of the situation. I think that women have done an amazing job of standing up and saying, look, this is not realistic. You cannot ask me to work a full-time job and raise my children from home. It's not possible. Because guess what? It's not. The people who say it is make a lot of excuses and usually have a lot of resources as to why other people don't. I wholeheartedly believe that it's not healthy to expect somebody to be able to try to raise a huge family like that on their own and do everything else. There's only so many hours in the day. You're either going to be a great parent or a great worker. I have not seen anybody who's been able to strike the balance. That doesn't mean, again, that it doesn't exist. In my personal experience, this is just what I've seen. So if you want to flag me for that, that's fine. Um, we're all experiencing the grief of loss. None of us are mourning. And how this is coming out is like I talked about yesterday with comparative grief. And again, going back to my home care workers, the comments of at least you get to stay at home, at least you have a job, the bitterness, like we're all feeling signs of sadness and sorrow and grief. We're getting agitated for no reason. We're getting really short with each other. We have no distress tolerance. We are really emotional, however you want to define that word for you. For me, it is I've been so reactive the last couple of months for a couple of reasons, but I know that being on lockdown and the quarantine and the pandemic is part of it. We are not, as a country, mourning all of the losses. We're actually in outright denial because we're sitting here talking about trying to open the country back up when the United States is the biggest epicenter of the pandemic. Like, we're in denial. Like, we're going to talk stages of grief tomorrow. Like, that's just precursor, heads up. Tomorrow is stages of grief because I'm seeing this play out on a national level like nobody's business. Like, this is ridiculous. I never thought really and truly in a million years that being a hospice social worker would ever give me any kind of insight into the national psyche, but like, damn if it hasn't. So tomorrow's going to be the stages of grief. One of those is denial, and we are in straight up denial about what's going on, the severity, the impact, the reality. The number of people that I hear in stores, like when I was returning my U-Haul, I had to listen, and admittedly, it was an older white guy arguing with an older black gentleman who was minding his own business, wearing a respirator, getting verbally assaulted by this old white guy about how the numbers don't add up and it's all a bunch of nonsense and Governor Northam doesn't know what he's doing and this man is in the most vulnerable population and is just railing against all of this. Like and sometimes I wonder, like, if you haven't worked healthcare, like, is it possible to understand? But the reality is that everybody is grieving a loss of some sense. If you're on a certain end of the political spectrum, you're going to see this as a loss of personal freedom. That's what you're grieving, is your loss of personal freedom that you've perceived in all of this. And we haven't made room for mourning because we don't know how to collectively mourn. Because we know how to hold grief. We're full of grief. National tragedies, wars. I mean, look at our veterans, okay? Like I talked about them yesterday. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Desert Shield. These people know how to sit and hold with grief. How many of them have actually mourned it? All of us right now are sitting with huge amounts of grief over the way that our lives have changed in inalterable ways. But we have not figured out how to mourn. We have not figured out that process because we're still trying to stick with the status quo of I have to work a 40-hour job if I am lucky enough to still have a 40-hour job, and I have to keep like basically we feel as though we're being told we have to maintain the same even though there's not this massive event going on. So that's today, grieving versus mourning, what it looks like both in the hospice context and outside of hospice. I really appreciate you taking the time again to sit, listen, learn. If anything was unclear, please drop a comment, let me know. I'm happy to answer, go in more detail. If this is helpful, let me know. If it's not helpful, definitely let me know. Tomorrow, like I said, we'll be talking about the 5 stages of grief and my experience with them. And I also just want to give a reminder in general that what I talk about is framed from my experience. I do not speak in absolutes. I don't speak gospel truth. I don't know everything. It's just based off of my own personal experiences. So if you have one that differs, I would love to have a dialogue on that. Please reach out. Like I love hearing different opinions. So I hope everybody has a good Sunday. It is Sunday, right? I think it's Sunday. We'll find out. I'm not going to bother to check. Regardless of what day of the week it is, I hope you're having a good one. I hope it is peaceful. I hope it is calm. I hope this has given you something to think about. And I will see you all tomorrow when we talk about the 5 stages of grief. Bye.